Dear Mom, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get to say goodbye. What if these were the final words from someone you love the most? Stay with us to uncover a story of love, loss, and an unforgettable legacy that will leave you speechless. The sky above Martin's Halliday's small hometown seemed brighter the day he was born, or so his mother, Jessica, always said. He was her miracle baby, arriving after years of heartbreak and struggles. Jessica had no one to lean on but herself, and she vowed to give Martins a life better than her own. From the moment he could walk, she instilled in him two core principles: work hard and never let circumstances define you. Jessica worked multiple jobs, cleaning houses by day and sewing clothes by night, to put Martins through the best schools she could afford. On weekends, she taught him lessons she believed no classroom could: how to treat people with kindness, the importance of integrity, and how to dream big even when the world seemed small. Martins took every lesson to heart. By his early 30s, Martins had transformed those lessons into a success story that made headlines. A brilliant entrepreneur, he launched a groundbreaking tech startup that revolutionized home automation. Investors couldn't get enough of him. The boy with a bright mind and an even brighter soul, one article had called him. But for all his fame and success, Martins never let it change who he was. Every Sunday, no matter how busy his schedule, Martins would drive back to the modest house where he grew up. He'd sit with Jessica at their small kitchen table, savoring her homemade meals, and listen to her proudly recount stories of his childhood. "You were always special, Martins," she'd say, tears glistening in her eyes. "But it's your heart that makes me proud." Martins would smile and say, "That's all because of you, Mom." It was during one of these visits that Martins mentioned someone new in his life. "Her name's Regina," he said, his face lighting up as he spoke. "She's smart, confident, and so full of life. I think you'll like her." Jessica first met Regina Samuel a few weeks later at a hockey club where Martins often went to relax. Regina was undeniably stunning. Her tailored dress hugged her figure perfectly, and her hair was styled in loose waves that framed her striking face. She exuded confidence, shaking Jessica's hand firmly while flashing a dazzling smile. "She's something else, isn't she, Mom?" Martins asked later that evening, his voice filled with excitement. Jessica hesitated. There was something about Regina that felt off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but a mother's intuition whispered caution. Still, seeing her son so happy, Jessica pushed aside her doubts and replied, "If she makes you happy, Martins, then that's all I care about." It wasn't long before Martins and Regina tied the knot in a grand ceremony. Regina insisted on keeping her maiden name, explaining it as a symbol of her independence. Martins didn't mind. He loved her free-spirited nature. Jessica, however, couldn't shake the feeling that Regina's independence was more about pride than principle. As the months went by, Jessica began to notice troubling changes in her son. Martins, once so full of energy and optimism, seemed increasingly withdrawn. When she asked about his work, he dismissed her questions with vague answers, a stark contrast to the animated way he used to talk about his dreams. During one visit, Jessica overheard Regina speaking on the phone in the next room. "Of course, I love him," she said, her tone clipped and irritated. "But let's be honest, the money is the real deal here." Jessica froze, her chest tightening. When Regina hung up, she turned and smiled sweetly at Jessica, as though nothing had happened. Jessica tried to brush it off, convincing herself that she had misunderstood. After all, Martin seemed to love Regina deeply, and who was she to interfere in his marriage? But as time went on, the doubts gnawed at her. Regina began to flaunt Martin's wealth more openly, talking about their vacations, designer clothes, and the new cars she wanted him to buy. Jessica couldn't help but notice how little Regina seemed to care about Martin's well-being. One evening, after a particularly stressful week, Martins called Jessica. His voice sounded hollow. "Mom," he said softly, "do you ever feel like no matter how much you give, it's never enough?" Jessica's heart broke hearing the sadness in her son's voice. "Martins, what's wrong? You can talk to me." He hesitated. "Nothing, Mom. Just tired." He quickly changed the subject, but Jessica knew something was deeply wrong. Though she didn't want to admit it, Jessica couldn't ignore the warning signs any longer. Martins was slipping away, and it felt as though there was nothing she could do. As she sat alone in her quiet house that evening, a sense of foreboding settled over her. She prayed that her son's troubles were temporary, but in her heart, she feared something much darker lay ahead. The call came late one evening, shattering the fragile peace of Jessica Halliday's quiet home. "Mrs. Halliday," the voice on the other end said, cold and clinical. "I'm so sorry to inform you, but your son Martins has passed away. It appears to have been a heart attack." Jessica's legs gave way, and she collapsed into her chair. Her vibrant, healthy son, the boy who had been her reason for living, was gone. It didn't make sense. She clutched the phone, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Are you sure?" "He was fine. He was fine." The next few days passed in a blur. Jessica found herself going through the motions of grief, unable to fully comprehend the finality of it all. She stared at Martin's childhood photos, her tears soaking into the edges of the frames. Her mind swirled with unanswered questions. How could a man so full of life, with no history of heart problems, die so suddenly? Regina's behavior, however, did little to provide comfort. On the day after Martin's death, Regina arrived at Jessica's house wearing a perfectly tailored black dress and a mask of forced sorrow. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, her tone lacking any real emotion. Jessica tried to embrace her, but Regina stood stiff, pulling back too quickly. Instead of staying to console Jessica, Regina began making phone calls, speaking in hushed tones about Martin's estate. That night, she left without a word, driving away in Martin's car. Regina wasted no time asserting herself as the heir to Martin's fortune. Within days, she had taken control of the estate and moved into his sprawling home, redecorating and hosting extravagant dinners. Her so-called grief seemed to vanish the moment she crossed the threshold. Jessica's unease grew with each passing day. While sifting through Martin's belongings for keepsakes, she stumbled upon a stack of papers in his study. They were draft revisions of his will, marked with his handwriting. The revisions clearly stated his intentions to leave a significant portion of his wealth to a charity supporting orphan children, a cause he had championed since adopting Emily and Mike. Yet Regina's name was absent in the revisions. Jessica's stomach turned. Why hadn't Martins finalized these changes? Had he been planning to confront Regina about it? And why had he never mentioned it to her? Despite her mounting suspicions, Jessica chose to stay silent. She wanted proof, something undeniable. 2 weeks later, Regina hosted a lavish memorial service for Martins, complete with expensive flower arrangements and an open bar. The event felt more like a networking gala than a mourning ceremony. Regina, dressed in an elegant black gown, floated from group to group, her laughter cutting through the somber atmosphere. Jessica stood on the sidelines, her heart aching. She felt like a stranger at her own son's memorial. When she confronted Regina about the extravagant expenses, Regina snapped, "I'm honoring his memory in the way he deserves. Isn't that what you want?" Jessica's fists clenched. "I want answers, Regina." Regina's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, someone called her away. Jessica watched her go, the suspicion in her chest growing heavier. The day of Martin's funeral was bitterly cold. The sky hung low and gray, mirroring Jessica's heart. Friends and family gathered under a canopy of black umbrellas, the wind carrying whispers of disbelief and sorrow. As the service reached its conclusion, Jessica's voice broke through the silence. "Wait," she said, stepping forward. "I want to see my son." Regina froze, her mask of composure cracking for the first time. "Jessica, that's not necessary," she said quickly. He's at peace now." "I need to see him," Jessica insisted, her tone firm. "One last time." The funeral director hesitated, glancing between the two women. Regina's protests grew louder, but Jessica's resolve was unshakable. "Open it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. The lid was lifted slowly, revealing Martin's face. Gasps filled the air. His complexion was pale, too pale, and his features looked almost waxy, as if something had been done to him. His once lively eyes now appeared sunken, his lips unnaturally stiff. Jessica staggered back, her heart racing. Something wasn't right. This wasn't how her son should look, even in death. She turned to Regina, whose face had gone ghostly white. "What have you done?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. Regina said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. The unease that had been building in Jessica's heart erupted into full-blown suspicion. Jessica clenched her fists. She didn't know what had happened to her son, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to stop until she found the truth. The weight of suspicion pressed on Jessica's chest like a stone. She couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister had happened to Martin's. The image of his pale, waxy face haunted her, and Regina's erratic behavior only fueled her doubts. Unable to find peace, Jessica decided to act. She reached out to a private investigator, Mr. Henry Foster, a seasoned professional with a reputation for uncovering hidden truths. "I need answers," Jessica told him, her voice resolute. "Whatever it takes." Within days, Henry returned with findings that sent shivers down Jessica's spine. "Mrs. Halliday," he said grimly, sliding a report across the table. "Martins didn't die of a heart attack. He was poisoned." Jessica's breath caught. "Poisoned? By whom?" Henry hesitated. "We found traces of a rare toxin in his blood, something that mimics heart attack symptoms. It's not easy to come by, and whoever used it likely had premeditated this for weeks, maybe longer." Jessica's mind raced. The pieces began to fall into place. Regina's cold demeanor, her obsession with Martin's wealth, the rushed funeral, and her desperation to keep the coffin closed. As the investigation deepened, Regina's actions became more suspicious. Henry reported that she was making large cash withdrawals and rapidly selling off Martin's properties. Jessica could feel the walls closing in on Regina, but the lack of concrete evidence left her hands tied. One night, Jessica couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, too empty without Martin's laughter echoing through its halls. She wandered into his old room, hoping to find solace among his belongings. It was there that she stumbled upon his old phone, tucked into a drawer beneath a pile of papers. Curious, Jessica powered it on. To her surprise, there was a saved voice recording dated just a week before Martin's death. With trembling hands, she pressed play. "Mom," Martin's voice began, strained and heavy. "If you're hearing this, it means something's happened to me. I don't want to sound paranoid, but Regina's been pressuring me to sign over control of the company. I've caught her forging my signature on some documents. I'm scared, Mom. If anything happens to me, it's not an accident." Jessica dropped the phone, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Tears streamed down her face as anger and sorrow consumed her. Martins had known he was in danger, yet he hadn't confided in her. The next day, Jessica marched into Regina's estate, holding the phone tightly in her hand. She found Regina lounging by the pool, sipping champagne as though she hadn't a care in the world. "Jessica," Regina drawled, her lips curling into a thin smile. "To what do I owe this surprise visit?" Jessica's hand trembled with fury. "You poisoned him," she spat. "You killed my son." Regina's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her expression hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jessica stepped closer, her voice rising. "Martins knew what you were doing. He left this." She held up the phone, playing the recording for Regina to hear. For the first time, Regina's confidence faltered. Her face paled as she listened to Martin's words, but she quickly recovered, sneering. "You have no proof. That's just a paranoid man rambling." Jessica's voice dropped, cold and sharp. "I'm taking this to the police." Regina's composure finally cracked. "You won't get away with this," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. But Jessica simply turned and walked away, her steps steady and unyielding. Armed with the recording and Henry's findings, Jessica went to the authorities. The evidence was damning. Investigators began piecing together the timeline, uncovering a trail of deceit and greed. Regina had slowly administered the poison over weeks, careful to mask the symptoms as natural causes. She had forged Martin's signature on key documents, transferring control of his assets to herself. It was all part of her elaborate plan to eliminate him and seize his fortune. The police acted swiftly. Regina was arrested during one of her lavish parties, her guests looking on in shock as officers handcuffed her. She screamed and struggled, shouting, "This is a mistake. I'm innocent." But the evidence was irrefutable. As she was dragged away, her once pristine image crumbled, revealing the cold, calculating woman beneath the surface. Jessica watched the news that evening, her hands trembling as Regina's arrest was broadcast across the screen. Tears welled in her eyes, not out of joy, but from a deep, aching sadness. Justice had been served, but it wouldn't bring Martins back. Still, she clung to the hope that her persistence had honored his memory. She whispered to the empty room, "I'll protect your legacy, Martins. I promise." The weeks following Regina's arrest were a whirlwind of court hearings, media frenzy, and endless legalities. Through it all, Jessica remained steadfast, driven by a singular purpose: to honor her son's memory. As she sifted through Martin's belongings, she came across a sealed envelope marked for Mom. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a letter in Martin's familiar handwriting. ***, Dear Mom. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get to say goodbye. But I want you to know how much you mean to me. Life wasn't always kind to us, but you gave me everything you had. And because of you, I've been able to do the same for others. You always taught me to look beyond myself, to see the people who need help the most. That's why I adopted Emily and Mike. They've had a rough start in life, but they remind me of us. Resilient, hopeful, and stronger together. They'd brought light to my life in ways I can't explain. I dream of watching them grow up, guiding them as you did for me. If I'm not there, I know you'll take care of them. Thank you for being my hero, Mom. I love you. Martins ***. Jessica pressed the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She had lost her son, but she hadn't lost his dreams or the love he poured into the world. Emily and Mike, his two adopted children, were his final gift to her, a reminder of his heart and his hope for the future. Jessica immediately began the process of formally reuniting with Emily, 3, and Mike, 5. When she first met them, their wide, uncertain eyes softened when she knelt down and said, "I'm your grandma, Jessica. You're home now, and I'll always be here for you." The children brought life and laughter back into Jessica's home. Emily's giggles echoed through the halls, while Mike's boundless curiosity kept her on her toes. In their innocence, she found a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just carrying on Martin's legacy, she was living it. To preserve her son's vision, Jessica founded the Martins Holiday Foundation, a nonprofit aimed at supporting young entrepreneurs who lacked the resources to chase their dreams. Every program launched by the foundation carried Martin's name, ensuring his work would continue to inspire generations. At the foundation's opening ceremony, Jessica stood before a crowd of supporters, holding Emily and Mike's hands tightly. Martins believed in the power of giving back, she said, her voice steady. Through this foundation, his light will continue to shine. The audience erupted in applause, but Jessica's eyes were fixed on the sky, silently thanking Martins for guiding her even now. Meanwhile, Regina's life unraveled completely. Her trial revealed the full extent of her deceit and cruelty, painting her as a cold-hearted schemer willing to kill for wealth. The courtroom gasped as the prosecutor laid out the evidence: the poison, the forged documents, and a recording of Martin's fears. The jury's verdict was swift: guilty. Regina was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Her once glamorous image was shattered, and she was left to face the weight of her actions in the solitude of her cell. She became a cautionary tale, her greed and ambition consuming everything until there was nothing left. Months later, on a quiet, sunny morning, Jessica visited Martin's grave with Emily and Mike by her side. She carried a single white rose, a symbol of love and remembrance. As she knelt before the headstone, she whispered, "You were right, Martins. Love truly endures. I promise to protect them, just as you protected me." The children, too young to understand the depth of her words, giggled and played among the nearby flowers. Jessica stood, her heart swelling with a bittersweet mixture of loss and hope. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow on the grave. It felt as though Martins himself were smiling down on them, his love eternal and unbroken. Engraved on the headstone were the words, "He gave hope to others, even in his darkest moments. Love endures, and legacies live on." For the first time since Martin's passing, Jessica felt a deep sense of peace. She took Emily and Mike's hands, and together they walked away, ready to embrace the future with the love and strength Martins had taught them. As we've seen, love is a force that transcends even the deepest tragedies. Martin's story teaches us that the actions we take in life echo far beyond our time here. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch your heart and inspire your soul. Thank you for watching, and remember, love endures, and legacies live on.